It began with a silence. Not the silence of a sleeping city, but the kind that settles when something deep inside a state begins to crumble, quietly, without alarms, without warning. Somewhere inside Israel's most secretive organization, a signal went dark. Files vanished. Codes no longer matched. And for the first time, Mossad, the agency that prided itself on knowing everything, had lost track of one of its own. Before we move further, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe. Because in this episode, we're opening the classified story Mossad never wanted the world to hear. The one that shows how its greatest power became its greatest weakness. For decades, Mossad was built on an image: ruthless precision, silence, invisibility. The agency's name itself carried an aura of invincibility across the Middle East. Its successes, assassinations, infiltrations, covert operations were whispered with a mix of fear and fascination. But behind that reputation was something else, something far more fragile. A system held together by secrecy and trust, both of which can shatter from within. This story doesn't begin with an enemy or a battlefield. It begins with the quiet arrogance that grows when power goes unquestioned. Mossad had become too confident, too insulated, too used to operating beyond oversight, shielded not only from the public, but even from the political bodies meant to supervise it. Over time, the agency's walls grew high, but its foundations grew hollow. Intelligence agencies live and die by one thing: control of information. Yet, in Mossad's case, the obsession with secrecy became its own blind spot. Within its secure facilities, information was fragmented across compartments. Agents knew only fragments of the truth. Analysts saw only what their section allowed. It was a structure designed to prevent leaks, but in reality, it created the perfect conditions for one. By the early 2000s, global intelligence networks were shifting. The old world of handwritten reports and coded radio bursts had been replaced by digital archives, vast databases of operations, surveillance, and agent identities. Mossad, like every major intelligence service, moved fast to modernize. But modernization brought exposure. A single individual with access to classified data could, with the right intent and the right tools, compromise everything. And that's exactly what happened. Somewhere deep in the network, an operative, highly trusted, highly trained, began siphoning information. The breach didn't come from an enemy infiltration or a physical break-in. It came from within the very system Mossad had sworn could never fail. The agency's internal audits would later reveal how the signals first appeared: unusual access logs, discrepancies in data transfer records, communications that seemed slightly off. At first, these were dismissed as routine system errors. But they weren't. They were the earliest signs of a betrayal that would shake Israel's intelligence establishment to its core. Mossad had long believed its internal culture of loyalty and ideological alignment would protect it from inside threats. Recruitment was based not only on skill, but also on belief. Belief in the mission, in the narrative of a small nation surrounded by enemies. But what happens when that belief cracks? The answer lies in the human side of intelligence. The agents who, behind the secrecy, are still flesh and blood. History shows that betrayals in espionage rarely come from strangers. They come from people who once believed, and then stopped believing. Disillusionment, moral conflict, personal grievance. These are the real tools of espionage. Independent regional analysts have pointed out that Mossad's greatest structural weakness was psychological, not technical. Its reliance on secrecy fostered a culture where questioning authority was seen as betrayal, and silence was survival. When individuals within the system began to see contradictions between the public ideals and the covert realities, cracks formed in their loyalty. Those cracks, once opened, became leaks. This leak, the one that would later be called Israel's greatest intelligence failure, exposed more than files and codes. It exposed the illusion of control. For decades, Mossad's image was built on total command. Every operation measured, every agent replaceable, every threat neutralized. But when the betrayal came from within, the agency had no playbook. The internal investigation that followed would be shrouded in secrecy, much of it still classified today. But fragments of the story, court documents, leaked testimonies, and international investigations reveal a clear pattern. Mossad had ignored warning signs for years. Its compartmentalized systems meant that no single department saw the full picture, and the few who suspected something were silenced or sidelined. Inside the agency, fear took hold. Every terminal, every agent, every external contact became a potential suspect. The paranoia that once made Mossad efficient now turned inward. Investigators interrogated their own colleagues. Files disappeared overnight. What had once been a fortress of intelligence turned into a maze of distrust. One of the most chilling revelations that later surfaced was how this betrayal didn't just compromise Israel's national security. It endangered countless lives. Foreign assets who had risked everything to cooperate were suddenly exposed. Safe houses across multiple countries were blown. In some cases, agents simply vanished, quietly erased in retaliation or silenced to prevent scandal. The moral question grew impossible to ignore. Was the enemy outside, or had the enemy been created by the system itself? Independent scholars from the region argue that Mossad's obsession with domination and its disregard for transparency or accountability inevitably led to this point. When an intelligence service believes it is above the law eventually comes for it in another form, through exposure. By the time Mossad realized the scale of the leak, it was already too late. The compromised data had traveled through digital channels far beyond recovery. Attempts to trace it led to dead ends, encrypted servers, anonymous accounts, and whispers of foreign intelligence services watching quietly from the sidelines, satisfied to see the once feared Mossad bleeding from within. Inside Israel, the government scrambled to contain the fallout. Official statements denied everything. State-controlled media downplayed the story. Yet, within the region's intelligence circles, the damage was obvious. For the first time in decades, Mossad wasn't feared. It was pitied. Its enemies saw the weakness. Its allies saw the chaos. And its own agents saw what their institution had become, a shadow of its former self, terrified of the truth it created. The most unsettling part of this story is that it didn't end with arrests or justice. It ended with silence. The accused were quietly removed, trials held in secrecy, records sealed from the public. But in the underground world of intelligence, rumors spread fast, the kind that destroy reputations faster than bullets. And as the world moved on, Mossad's image recovered on the surface. But deep inside, the scars remained. Its systems grew tighter, its secrecy deeper. The agency became even more insulated, less accountable, and far more paranoid. But the truth, the one they tried to bury, is that the betrayal from within was never fully solved. Some say the real spy was never caught. Others believe the cover-up was deliberate, that exposing the full truth would have shattered Israel's global alliances and public image forever. Whatever the truth, one fact remains unshaken. Mossad, the hunter of traitors, was once hunted by its own. It started with a man who knew too much and trusted too little. He was one of Mossad's own, a skilled operator respected for his precision and reliability. For years, he had moved in silence through Europe and the Middle East, collecting fragments of information that shaped Israel's most critical covert strategies. To his superiors, he was a loyal asset. To the agency's internal record, he was beyond suspicion. But under that reputation, something was changing. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. It was the slow corrosion of conviction, the kind that grows when belief turns into disillusionment. Within Mossad, dissent was rare, almost forbidden. Questioning the mission meant questioning the state itself. Yet as this operative watched the agency's methods grow darker, assassinations justified under national security, civilian casualties dismissed as collateral necessity, and surveillance operations targeting even allies, he began to see the system differently. He had joined believing Mossad protected Israel. He stayed long enough to realize it was protecting itself. The turning point came during a mission that went wrong. Deeply wrong. In a European capital, a covert assassination went off script. A civilian was mistakenly killed, and the target escaped. The agency quickly buried the incident, falsifying the report and blaming it on an informant who had no chance to defend himself. For the operative, that cover-up was the last straw. In that moment, his silence ended. The process of betrayal began with a single decision. Not out of greed, but out of anger. The operative began documenting what he saw as systematic lies, internal corruption, political manipulation, and operations that violated international laws. What started as notes in a coded journal evolved into a full archive, a record of Mossad's hidden failures. At first, his goal wasn't to sell, it was to expose. He reached out through back channels, indirectly, to intermediaries in Eastern intelligence and media. But exposure in this world comes at a cost, and soon, foreign intelligence networks took notice. Iran, Russia, and several Arab security agencies were all aware that someone inside Mossad was leaking. For them, this wasn't just information. It was a strategic weapon. The operative, caught between moral conviction and fear, began playing a dangerous game. He didn't fully trust anyone, not Mossad, not the outsiders. But he needed to survive. And survival in espionage means trade. He began releasing fragments of data, testing responses. The leaks were small at first. Lists of non-official covers, details about Mossad's surveillance techniques, safe house locations that had already been compromised. Each piece of data was like bait, designed to measure who was listening. When Mossad noticed the leaks, it didn't realize they came from within. The agency assumed it was a cyber intrusion, likely by a rival intelligence service. Internal cyber units began sweeping through servers, tracing digital fingerprints across Europe, the Gulf, and Asia. They found anomalies, but all external. None pointed inward. That was the genius of the betrayal. The traitor understood Mossad's detection systems better than anyone. He knew which logs were checked, which weren't, and how to manipulate timestamps. By the time the agency considered an internal leak, the damage had already crossed borders. Regional security experts have described this moment as the modern silent explosion, a phrase that captures how the entire Israeli intelligence network suddenly fractured without warning. Dozens of Mossad's external operations were compromised within weeks. A series of safe houses in Turkey, Cyprus, and Jordan were abruptly abandoned. Communication networks were reset. Foreign collaborators went missing. Inside Mossad headquarters, fear began turning into chaos. The director ordered a total lockdown. All agents were recalled, external operations frozen. Every workstation was audited, every operative interrogated. But the system itself was too big, too old, too fragmented. A handful of internal investigators suspected the leak was coming from a senior operations unit, one that handled European surveillance and infiltration missions. They began tracing metadata, narrowing down access logs, and eventually they found a pattern. Someone was accessing files outside their operational scope, often during hours when the building was supposedly empty. The suspect list narrowed, but by the time they reached the operative, he was gone. Disappearing from Mossad's radar isn't easy. Agents live under multiple identities, but the agency always has a way to find them. Yet this one had prepared for years. He had built his exit carefully. Fake trails, misdirection, cash reserves, and a contingency network of foreign contacts. By the time Mossad traced him to Eastern Europe, he was already across the border, protected by people who wanted exactly what he carried. The inner architecture of Israel's most secret intelligence organization. The leak that followed was unlike anything Mossad had faced. It wasn't a single document or disk. It was a digital cache, structured, labeled, and timed to release progressively. It contained details of covert missions across 2 decades, agent identities, logistical maps, and surveillance footage. The information didn't just compromise operations, it revealed Mossad's entire blueprint. Among the files were details of cyber programs aimed at regional infrastructure, covert funding channels tied to political lobbies, and surveillance operations conducted under the guise of diplomatic missions. The revelations hit intelligence circles across the Middle East like a shockwave. For countries long targeted by Mossad, this was vindication, proof of what they had always accused Israel of doing. But for Israel, it was devastation. The agency that prided itself on infiltration had been infiltrated by its own. Internally, Mossad launched a campaign of disinformation, quietly leaking false leads suggesting the betrayal came from foreign cyber hackers or a rogue contractor. But behind closed doors, the truth was clearer. The breach was human, not digital. It came from a trusted officer who saw too much, who lost faith in what he served, and who decided the truth mattered more than loyalty. The Israeli leadership moved swiftly to suppress public discussion. Official denials were issued, and any trace of the incident was classified under national emergency. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence services, particularly in Europe and the US, quietly reduced cooperation with Mossad. For them, trust had been broken. If Israel's internal controls could be breached from within, their own information was no longer safe. In regional diplomatic circles, the incident became a whispered example of poetic justice. The spy service that had long manipulated others now falling victim to its own methods. Intelligence analysts across the Middle East highlighted this as a turning point. The myth of Mossad's invulnerability had been shattered, replaced by a more realistic picture, a flawed institution capable of error, deception, and moral decay. As months passed, the agency's silence grew deeper. Those suspected of complicity were quietly removed or reassigned. Families were relocated. Files were sealed permanently. Even within Israel, few knew the full scope of what happened. The media was tightly restricted, and investigations into national security breaches were conducted behind closed courts. But in the intelligence world, secrets rarely die. Fragments of the leak continued surfacing in encrypted forums and foreign archives. Regional investigative journalists obtained partial datasets, redacted but authentic, confirming that the leak had indeed occurred, and that it had forced Mossad to rebuild parts of its operational network from scratch. Behind the reconstruction, however, the same old flaws remained. The agency doubled down on secrecy, paranoia, and internal surveillance. Whistleblowing or dissent was equated with treason. Instead of reform, Mossad chose silence. It learned the wrong lesson. Not transparency, but tighter control. Independent intelligence observers have often said that this episode marked the beginning of Mossad's moral collapse, the moment when the organization's pursuit of power destroyed the very trust it depended on. For decades, Mossad operated on the belief that loyalty was absolute. But absolute loyalty, without accountability, breeds rot. The operative who leaked the secrets has never been found. Some claim he defected to a hostile nation and lives under protection. Others say he was silenced long ago, buried under another name in a foreign land. Mossad, officially, denies he ever existed. But the consequences of his actions remain visible in the agency's tightened structure, in the fear within its own ranks, and in the enduring suspicion that another betrayal could happen again. For intelligence agencies across the world, the lesson was simple. Even the most secret walls can crack from the inside. And when they do, the collapse isn't loud. It's silent, slow, and irreversible. The walls of Mossad's headquarters in Tel Aviv had never felt so quiet. For an organization built on motion, constant movement, constant watchfulness, silence was its worst enemy. Every conversation, every computer log, every file now carried the weight of suspicion. After the betrayal that tore open its network, Mossad was no longer an intelligence service at war with its enemies. It was an intelligence service at war with itself. The internal investigation that followed was unlike anything in the agency's history. Entire divisions were disbanded overnight. Field officers were pulled from missions mid-operation, interrogated for days, and released without explanation. Technicians spent weeks auditing servers line by line, while surveillance specialists monitored their own colleagues. The agency that once prided itself on absolute precision was now running on paranoia. Behind closed doors, the director convened what insiders later called the Gray Committee, a secret task force made up of counterintelligence veterans and cybersecurity analysts. Their job was not only to find the mole, but to erase the consequences of his actions, to reconstruct what had been destroyed, and to hide what could no longer be repaired. Yet the scope of the damage was staggering. Decades of work, informant networks in North Africa, covert listening posts in the Gulf, financial shell operations in Europe had been compromised. Many assets simply vanished. Some were arrested by local authorities. Others disappeared under mysterious circumstances. To protect what remained, Mossad activated emergency protocols that had not been used since the 1980s, the systematic closure of foreign safe houses, and the total re-encryption of communications. But containment came at a price. Every shutdown exposed another weakness. Each suspended operation meant another foreign government asking questions. Allies who once cooperated unconditionally began to hesitate. European intelligence partners reduced data sharing agreements, citing national security reassessment. In Washington, congressional oversight committees demanded classified briefings on how deeply American intelligence had been exposed. Mossad's public face, the carefully cultivated myth of omnipotence, began to fracture. Israeli media outlets were warned under national security laws not to report the scandal. But silence breeds curiosity. Rumors leaked through anonymous sources and foreign journalists, whispers of an agent gone rogue, of secret files traded abroad, of an invisible breach that shook the core of Israel's most powerful institution. Within the agency, the psychological toll was profound. Trust, once the invisible currency of espionage, evaporated. Senior operatives refused to share information outside their direct teams. Departments that once collaborated seamlessly now worked in isolation, each treating the other as a potential threat. The betrayal had done more than expose secrets. It had poisoned the culture from within. Some of the agency's veterans tried to understand the motive behind the leak. Was it ideology, revenge, or money? None of them had an answer, but they agreed on one thing. The operative who sold out Mossad had known exactly where to strike. He hadn't aimed at operations alone. He had targeted the agency's credibility. For Mossad, reputation was as powerful as intelligence itself. Its myth of invulnerability deterred enemies and reassured allies. To lose that aura was to lose leverage. And now, for the first time, rival intelligence agencies, from Tehran to Moscow, could exploit that weakness. In the months after the leak, counter-operations increased across the Middle East. Israeli informants were exposed and publicly tried. Cyber attacks targeted defense infrastructure linked to Tel Aviv. Each event seemed to echo one message: the myth is over. The Israeli government faced an impossible dilemma. Admitting the breach would trigger diplomatic fallout. Denying it would make recovery harder. Eventually, they chose a strategy of deflection, to frame the scandal as a foreign cyber operation, an external infiltration rather than a human betrayal. Official statements blamed state-sponsored hackers, emphasizing that no classified human assets had been compromised. It was a calculated half-truth. The public narrative was digital. The real one was human. Behind this facade, Mossad turned inward with brutal intensity. Internal security officers launched a purge. Dozens of employees were reassigned, investigated, or dismissed under suspicion of negligence. The agency also introduced new psychological screening for loyalty, focusing on behavioral patterns that might indicate disillusionment or ideological dissent. What had once been a service built on trust now depended on constant surveillance of its own. Inside the corridors, a sense of collective guilt took hold. Operatives who had spent their lives believing in a sacred mission began questioning what they had become. Was the betrayal a singular act of treason, or the symptom of something deeper? A reflection of moral decay within the agency itself? Some senior analysts privately admitted that Mossad's aggressive tactics abroad had blurred ethical lines for years. The operative's defection, in their view, was not an anomaly, but a consequence. While Israel sought to repair its networks, the effects rippled globally. In the Gulf, intelligence cooperation with Western partners became more cautious. Arab states that had recently engaged in quiet normalization talks with Israel reconsidered their pace. European governments began auditing joint counterterrorism programs. The betrayal had not only exposed Mossad, it had eroded confidence in Israel's role as a dependable partner. For rival powers, the chaos presented an opportunity. Intelligence analysts in Tehran and Damascus reportedly celebrated the incident as the unraveling of the myth. They saw it as proof that even the most sophisticated agencies could crumble from within. The revelation emboldened regional counter-espionage operations, targeted strikes on suspected Mossad cells, surveillance of Israeli diplomats, and cyber offensives against Israeli defense networks. Inside Israel, the political establishment demanded accountability. Parliamentary committees held closed-door hearings, questioning intelligence leaders about operational oversight. But the answers were buried under classification. The few public statements issued spoke of restructuring and strategic modernization. In reality, it was damage control. Amid the turmoil, Mossad began rebuilding, but not in the way many expected. Rather than reforming its ethical foundations, it focused on strengthening control. New AI-driven surveillance systems were installed to monitor internal communications. Loyalty tests were expanded, Information sharing between divisions was further restricted. It was a paradox. To protect itself from betrayal, Mossad became even more secretive, even more insular. Yet secrecy breeds fragility. The tighter the agency's grip, the more it risked suffocating the very adaptability that had once made it formidable. Younger operatives, those who entered after the scandal, were trained in an atmosphere of fear rather than conviction. They learned obedience, not initiative. Outside analysts later observed that this internal transformation weakened Mossad's creativity in the years that followed. Risk-averse, burdened by paranoia, the agency began relying more on technological intelligence and foreign cooperation than on human sources. The betrayal had scarred its confidence in people. Meanwhile, foreign archives began leaking portions of the stolen data to investigative journalists. Redacted files, authenticated by cybersecurity experts, hinted at operations long denied by Israel. Surveillance programs in Africa, sabotage efforts in the Gulf, and covert funding channels. Each new disclosure renewed international scrutiny, forcing Mossad to divert attention and resources toward damage control. The agency could no longer control the narrative. Once the world's most feared intelligence brand, it now faced questions about transparency, legality, and ethics. Even within Israel's political landscape, quiet divisions emerged between those who demanded reform and those who insisted on silence. By the second year after the betrayal, the wound had not healed. It had simply been hidden. Mossad had restored some of its networks and regained a degree of operational stability. But trust, internally and externally, remained fractured. The operative who exposed the secrets was still missing, his fate unknown. The files he leaked continued to circulate in the gray corners of the digital world, a constant reminder of what had happened. For Mossad, the scandal was more than a security breach. It was a reckoning. It revealed that even within the fortress of secrecy, human conscience could still break through. The betrayal forced Israel's most powerful agency to confront an uncomfortable truth: that power, without accountability, corrodes from within. And though the agency would never publicly admit it, every new recruit who walked through its gates in the years that followed was told, quietly but firmly, trust no one completely, not even your own. The years that followed the betrayal were marked by quiet reconstruction. Mossad, shaken but unbroken, retreated further into the shadows. Layers of secrecy multiplied. Files were reclassified, internal audits sealed, and senior officers either retired early or vanished into unmarked assignments abroad. To the public eye, the agency appeared stronger, but behind closed doors, the scars were permanent. The betrayal had exposed not just names and operations, but a flaw in Mossad's core philosophy. For decades, its legend was built on ruthlessness, on the belief that Israel's survival justified every method: infiltration, assassination, blackmail, deception. The Traitors' Act forced a moral confrontation. What happens when a system that trusts no one finally turns on itself? Inside Israeli intelligence circles, the lesson was bitter. Mossad's directors knew they could rebuild networks, but they could not rebuild faith. Every operative carried that burden, the haunting awareness that one insider had undone what thousands had built. The betrayal had become a ghost within the system, whispering through every clearance check and coded transmission. Outside Israel, the world watched closely. Rivals saw opportunity. Allies saw vulnerability. Even within the West, quiet doubt emerged about how far Israel's intelligence reach extended and how far it was willing to go to preserve its dominance. In the Middle East, the narrative shifted. Mossad was no longer seen as untouchable but human and fallible. Yet in Tel Aviv, silence remained policy. The government avoided official acknowledgement, burying the scandal under classified reviews. Those who had investigated the leak vanished into retirement or diplomatic postings abroad. No one spoke publicly, not because they feared the truth, but because they understood its power. Privately, analysts agreed that Mossad's greatest loss was not operational, but psychological. The agency's aura, its myth of perfection, had died. And once a myth dies, it cannot be rebuilt. What emerged in its place was a colder, more calculated machine, efficient but hollow, capable but soulless. Even within Israel's defense community, quiet dissent grew. Some questioned whether the betrayal was punishment, not divine, but inevitable. A reckoning for decades of unchecked power, for operations that blurred the line between necessity and obsession, for treating enemies and assets alike as disposable. In the end, Mossad had not been defeated by foreign forces, but by its own reflection. The world moved on, as it always does, but the story lingered in classified reports, whispered among diplomats, taught in intelligence academies as a warning. Every intelligence service fears external threats, but the deadliest always come from within. And somewhere in the archives of a foreign capital, fragments of Mossad's stolen secrets still exist. Reminders of the moment when Israel's most feared institution was brought to its knees by one of its own. In the world of espionage, silence isn't peace, it's aftermath. This was the day Mossad's myth cracked from the inside. But in the shadows of that collapse, a new breed of intelligence warfare was born. Colder, smarter, and even less forgiving. We uncover how this betrayal reshaped global espionage, from Tehran to Langley, and how every intelligence service rewrote its playbook in the age of leaks. This is Spy Wars Declassified, where secrets are never buried, only delayed.